Okay, hello students of COM 1101, you're in the right place. I'm going to give you a little background on communication channels, communication devices. We're going to start to speak a little bit about communication per se. So let's get, there we go. Get everything out in front here. So you can watch your PowerPoint along with me, or you can, however that works for you, perhaps listen to me, take notes, and then look at your PowerPoint. We'll talk first about interpersonal communication. The gist of this course is mass communication. One person speaking to many, but I'm going to start out with interpersonal, which is usually one-to-one or one-to-two. It is between two or more people, but not a lot of people. Can be a face-to-face interaction, which you have every day, one-to-one, or through a channel of some sort, one-to-many. For example, public speaking, that's a channel. This is called mediation. When there is something between you, the speaker, and the listener, that's called mediated communication. That is the thing that comes between the two of you, between you and your audience, is called mediation. It can be a one-to-one interaction through a channel too. How? How do you have a one-to-one interaction through a channel? And it is interpersonal communication. Think about that. So mediation limits some things that face-to-face communication does not. What are these? What abilities are limited by mediation? So if I am speaking to you on the telephone is mediating our conversation. What does the telephone do to change the type of communication we have with each other? What does, all right, that's a telephone. I'm thinking of the old-time telephones where you do this, but then we have cell phones. What if you are using Skype? How does that change your communication? Think of all the electronic things that we do and have. What about a hi-fi, a stereo hi-fi, a radio? How does that change the communication? And then, of course, television. How does that do it? So now we get into mass communication. And since the printing press was invented in 1455 by Johann Gutenberg, until the introduction of the internet in the early to mid-90s, the framework of mass communication went pretty much unchanged. So there was always someone wanting to speak to many, but in order to do that, most of the time, there had to be some kind of mediation. Can you think of a situation where there doesn't have to be mediation and one person can speak to many? The framework that I'm talking about is, quote, media companies create content they believe the audience will want, and they distribute that content to an audience who has very few ways to provide immediate feedback. So we do have technology that does not allow for feedback. It allows us to get that communication. It allows the center to send that communication, but we can't discuss it. There's no feedback loop in that communication. Think about the types of communication channels that would do that. Some mass communication channels like TV and radio are synchronous. And some, like newspapers and magazines, are asynchronous. So when we say that TV and radio are synchronous, we mean that at sometimes the person watching or listening is doing that at the same time that the person creating the communication is doing that. Now in TV, you can have live television and you can have videotaped television. So if it's live television, and I sit down in front of live reporters to watch the news, I'm getting it synchronously at the same time. Now, however, if I decide to tape a program with some device, it runs when it runs. It could be live when it runs, but when I get back, I can replay that on video. So then it becomes asynchronous. So the time shift. The audio and video recording devices allow us to record live events and then watch them later, which is a way to turn a synchronous medium into an asynchronous medium. Somehow I still see how that live presentation went. I just didn't see it at the time that it was live. Digital media are now blurring the lines between interpersonal and mass communication. Quote, interpersonal communication is capable of adopting some characteristics of mass communication, and mass communication is trying to adopt certain characteristics of interpersonal communication. This is called convergence. Let me give you an example. Usually when you're driving around in your car, you're not watching television. Okay, so if I'm driving around in my car, and I remember when I first discovered this many years ago, they tried it. I was driving into Tallahassee, Florida, from Foley, Alabama. And I realized on my radio that I was getting the Phil Donahue Show. This was the TV show I was hearing as it was happening, but I had no television. They arranged for me to be able to hear in my car the program as it were a radio program. This is convergence. This is when two media converge to have some new kind of effect on the listener. Now, what are the functions of mass communication? This is all getting right down to the nitty-gritty of what mass communication really is, not where it began. There are four broad categories: surveillance, correlation, cultural transmission, and entertainment. And those can be, narrowed down into smaller categories. But what is surveillance? Well, surveillance is when we look at something, when we follow something visually, or audioly. It refers mostly to journalism, advertising, and public relations. This function is to get the news out to the public, warn about upcoming weather conditions, educate the public, etc. So just think of this in terms of those broad categories of endeavor, which are journalism, advertising, and public relations. How do we communicate with each other that way? And why? That surveillance, that was when they were talking about the weather conditions, it reminded me as a child, when we would get up in the morning, the first thing that we would see, and I can't remember if it was 5:30 or 6:30, but it was the weather report for farmers. I grew up in an agricultural area, and the farmers wanted to know what was going to happen today. Were we really going to get that rain or not? Should they go out and work in the fields, or should they select something else to do because they won't be able to get out there? So that was surveillance. Correlation is how we measure our view of the world with others' views, how we interpret events and issues to help us understand our roles in society. As we're growing up and we see sitcoms, let's say, well, as we go back and see something like Friends, we go, whoa, do people really live like that anymore? Well, we're talking sometimes 20, 30 years we go back. If we go way back, we're going back into the 60s and 70s, and you see Gunsmoke, and wow, did cowboys live like that? If we see something 20 years ago, we think, I remember we didn't have breakfast together as a family. We were always in too many different directions. But if you watch some of the old TV shows like Father Knows Best, they had every meal together except for lunch, because that's when everybody was gone. The father was away at work, but they had breakfast and dinner together at the breakfast table. So it's interesting to see. We had dinner together. That was the only one we could depend on we would have together.